Supply chain auditing, a really, in my opinion, exciting place to be for work because there's just so much need in making sure that these supply chains are working ethically. I know when we hear the word audit, it sounds like a lot of boring work, but it is so valuable to society. A supply chain audit monitors a supplier's performance to determine if it is in compliance with the relevant code of conduct. Choices in carrying out an audit. You can have an internal or an external audit by a third party. We're going to talk about both. And we're on page 387 of your text if you're following along. An internal audit, the company Gap does this quite often. They hire and train its own staff or auditors whose job it is to inspect factories and to determine whether or not they are in compliance. And the advantage of this is that the company controls and manages the process themselves, and it can determine what factories need to be audited and learn immediately about any problems that might be uncovered and have a resolution within the organization very quickly. But the problem here is that stakeholders might view reports based on an internal audit as less credible because the company would have an interest in casting itself and its suppliers in a favorable light. Personally, I was an auditor for Citibank for a year or so, and I went to different areas within Citibank to do internal audits of the organization. Because we reported to their CFO, I felt like we were held to a really high standard to report honestly. Of course, the areas of the bank that were being audited were not very happy when we came in because, we weren't looking at ethical processes because they were all in the United States, but that typically wasn't an issue, but we were looking at how efficient the operations were, and the managers who we went in to look at their operations efficiency, they were often scared about us criticizing, and we'll talk about that further in this chapter. But there, as this slide says, there are positive and negative things when it comes to internal auditors. Let's talk about external auditors. What do those do? PwC, right, is a top company that does external auditing. This is where a company hires another organization to carry out the audit and report back to the company. It's also called the third-party audit, as we mentioned already. The advantage here is that it's perceived by stakeholders as a more objective and credible. So when we talk about accounting audits, right, most likely, always you will have an external auditor because stakeholders really want to make sure that that is credible. But a disadvantage is that companies might find that the information is delayed because it takes some time to get that information, and it also does not directly control the quality of we can't directly control the quality of the audit. So that the company itself, they don't necessarily know if the audit was done correctly or not. It's not within their reach. They just trust that PwC or whatever other organization is doing it correctly. So let's talk more about audits and their drawbacks. On-site inspections, they can be expensive and time-consuming. As I said earlier, that Nike does over 400 audits a year, and these audits cost between $1,000 and $5,000 per audit at least, I would think. So it's hard to be scaled to cover a brand's entire supply chain. Nike admits that they have a lot of parts of their supply chain that is not being audited, and that came up a lot in your papers. Audits are not always unannounced. So in many cases, the suppliers receive advance notice and are able to stage conditions to pass the inspection, so they make the situation look good, right? They clean up the floors, they make it look nice and clean, they get rid of all the child labor, they make sure that the women are looking nice and well kempt. So they can't always be, we can't always necessarily see an honest representation of what the true situation is. And also workers sometimes distrust auditors. I had that happen to me quite a bit when I was an internal auditor. Not knowing if the inspectors represent the supplier, the brand, or an independent third party. So they're reluctant to share their true experiences. They're reluctant to really tell you whether they're being overworked or not worked enough, etc. So when I would go into these organizations within Citibank, it was hard to get true, live, real information out of the employees that we were speaking with. So let's talk about auditing approaches. What are your alternatives when you want to get a true, honest audit? So one thing is a crowdsourced audit, which I thought was really cool. I had never heard of this before, but this is where it gathers information about factory conditions directly from the workers using their mobile phones. So workers provide information directly by responding to questions generated by a recorded voice on their mobile phones when they're away from work, so they can hopefully get a more honest answer when they're not feel like they're being looked over their shoulder from their boss. And this is happening a lot in India and Bangladesh. But again, the workers really must trust that this information is being kept confidential and that it won't get back to their boss. Supply chain auditing goes on to say that companies are working together now to audit major suppliers and to share results in order to avoid audit fatigue. So this occurs when supplier factories must endure audit after audit conducted by different buyers, right? So Nike comes in and does an audit, then Adidas comes in and does a different audit. And so then the suppliers spend so much time and energy preparing and creating these audits that they are becoming inefficient. So to spare companies from duplicating efforts and incurring unnecessary costs, they again can have just one particular company come in and do these audits. And a company that does this is EcoVadis. That in 2017, EcoVadis had 30,000 subscribers, including Coca-Cola and Johnson & Johnson. And it sounds like they're doing a very efficient job of going in and auditing all of these suppliers in Asia, mostly Asia, right? Because they just recently raised $32 million in capital to support the development of their tools. They're going to do some AI, and they're going to automate some analyses to make this information more efficient and more available to all these different companies that want to access information about suppliers. So now we're in the final slides of part 2 of chapter 17. Let's talk about what do companies do when an audit reveals a gap. So I had this happen many times when I was at Citibank. What happens when there's a gap in my case efficiencies, but here, and maybe when they catch something going wrong when it comes to human rights or an environmental issue. So most audits turn up at least some instances in which a company's global operations are not in compliance. It happens, right? There's no perfect organization out there, no perfect supplier. So either a company will terminate a supplier if the supplier is unwilling to change or the deficiencies are egregious. Or 48% of companies in a recent survey said that they would terminate a supplier if certain cases, if violations were found. So just if they were found, then they would terminate the supplier right away. So really important that these organizations that are supplying these products are taking these audits very, very seriously. I like this slide because now this talks about supplier development and capability building. So these are activities that can be undertaken by companies to improve the performance of firms in their supply chain. So a lead firm may choose instead to invest time and resources to build a supplier's capability rather than terminating or punishing a supplier, right? So a company who produces this product, they can say, how can I help you better your supply chain? Lead firms decide to engage in capability building because the cost of switching suppliers may be too high, right? I can see very often, right, that Apple probably does this with Foxconn. They often don't have an option to go to a different supplier for that level of quality. And so if they find a gap in their audit, they need to work with them to better their processes. A supplier may have critical capabilities. The lead firm may feel a moral obligation to the workers and local community not to cause job loss if they change suppliers. And other suppliers may not be readily available to take over the contract, as I mentioned. Lead firms can provide a variety of rewards or incentives to suppliers that collaborate to build capabilities. Capability initiatives work best where interactions between buyer and supplier are frequent and ongoing. This is one of my favorite phrases, frequent and ongoing. It's not only between companies and suppliers, but also through senior level management and employees, right? I want frequent and ongoing communication between everyone because then everyone is on the same page and we're all moving forward together. Suppliers are more likely to engage when lead firms are prepared to offer them stable and long-term contracts, as we mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. Supplier development might take several forms: training, joint problem solving, and investing in equipment or infrastructure. It's really great when the parent, the owner of the product is invested in their supplier. Some companies have invested directly in improving the lives and professional skills of their suppliers' workers. This I thought was amazing, and this is why I'm so in support of globalization, because when we have things like this where the Gap, they supported a program called PACE, Personal Advancement and Career Enhancement. This is where they took $68,000 and they invested in women's life skills and technical training. And after these women had been engaged with this program called PACE, they improved their self-worth and they were better able to manage their work and their professional lives. So they're bettering the lives of these women. And that's why I think globalization is so important, that the U.S., who has a lot of development and know-how, education, money, that now they are investing in these developing nations. And it's not giving them a hand out, but a hand up, right? That they're investing in their education. And in return, we're getting these great products from the Gap or different organizations, but we're also helping these people take charge of their lives and creating better self-worth in these females, in these mothers, in these wives is just a really great opportunity to help society as a whole. And so this goes back to a root cause analysis, a root cause, right? You think of a root of a carrot. What is the cause of why these suppliers are not coming together to help with these issues? So we want to determine the underlying cause of repeated violations of a particular code requirement or standard. And so that's where we also look at to see that maybe there were too many styles that Nike was asking of their supplier, or too many changes in the style, one particular style, or there were too many rush orders. And so these cause a lack of efficiency in the supplier. And so if Nike then decides, okay, we're not going to create this sneaker in 10 different colors, we're only going to create the sneaker in 3 different colors, that creates efficiencies for the supplier and allows them to really work on improving their bottom line and be able to improve the working conditions for their employees. I'm a big fan of efficiencies, as you can see, because when I worked at Citibank and at Credit Suisse too, I was in groups called Efficiency Management, which was all about improving the operations of the bank. Let's talk about this next slide. Same title, Supplier Development Capability Building. This is where companies have developed organizational mechanisms to resolve differences in priorities internally and try to communicate expectations more clearly to suppliers. Again, all about communicating more clearly. I really love this one too because I have a master's in communications and I feel like it is so important and so valuable when people communicate clearly. The first bullet point here is integrated supplier scorecards. This is where we can rate suppliers on multiple dimensions, traditional dimensions such as cost, quality, and timelines, but we can also measure them on their social, ethical, and environmental performance. The example they give here is that Nike has introduced a manufacturing index, which measures and rewards suppliers on 4 dimensions: quality, on-time delivery, cost, and sustainability. So they give them, financial rewards based on these ideas. Also in Madagascar, we see that because this is such a great place to develop vanilla, that a lot of the companies have invested in education and in the families. So they're not just trying to get the product out of Madagascar, but they're also helping to bring the society up. This happens here in our state of California. As I've mentioned before, I do a lot of consulting for the Wonderful Company, and they grow almonds and pistachios and avocados in the Central Valley, and they've developed a huge network of schools and gyms and career counseling opportunities for the families that support the farmers and the people who work in the fields in the Central Valley of California. Also, they do another product of theirs is Fiji water, and I've spoken about in this course. They help the society and the families in Fiji water who help to collect and bottle the water that we drink here in the U.S. Before I hop on to the next slide, I also wanted to mention that Puma does a lot of great work. they have also gotten involved in the economics of their supplier, and they help lower the borrowing costs to suppliers who meet these social and environmental standards. So they will help lend money, or not lend money, but guarantee the money that these suppliers are borrowing to expand their factories potentially, and so that they can borrow money at a lower cost, which makes the whole system a whole lot more efficient. Let's talk about supplier development and capability benefit building, and what are the benefits of this? Again, research shows that when companies invest in suppliers and their employees, exchange knowledge and collaborate on improvements, they create shared value that benefits both parties. This is also known as synergies. The last slide that we have in this chapter is where it talks about where lead firm responses to supply chain audits of social, economic, and environmental performance. This is talking about monitoring and remediation of the supply chain, building up the capabilities, and then we have this shared value, otherwise known as synergy. So everything's moving forward with this arrow in a positive direction. And so I hope you enjoyed learning about business and suppliers, Chapter 17. I'm Professor Green. As I said, this is a big topic when we talk about ethics and sustainability, and also a big topic for me because I feel like there's just so much opportunity for increased efficiency and helping people in these developing nations to better their quality of life. Great. I look forward to seeing you in class.